Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. Hello and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Hockton. I'm a public historian, author and broadcaster. My apologies for the delay in getting this podcast to you as well. I've been off the air for about 3 weeks now. What I'm trying to do is produce, one podcast a week, two if I can. But sadly, life and sometimes work gets in the way. And of course, those of you who know me from There's Always Tea, which is another podcast that I do, know that this isn't a full-time job for me. I do it because I'm passionate about the subjects that I talk about. So I'm going to endeavor to try harder and to get these to you in a timely fashion moving forward. And hopefully I'm going to try and stick to that schedule. So my sincere apologies to those of you who have been asking, but thanks for sticking with me. So earlier in the year on my other podcast, which I just mentioned, which I co-host with Nikki Jordan, There's Always Tea, we aired a podcast, a really fun podcast actually, on, it was actually titled, Did William Shakespeare Really Write Those Plays? And our conclusion was that he did, or at the very least, he co-authored them, which was actually quite common in those days. But in the end, it didn't actually matter whether he wrote those plays or not, because what we're left with is an incredible body of work that actually surpasses the actual writer. And I have to say that I'm actually a massive Shakespeare fan. Some of his plays we covered in English Lit when I was in school, and I was hooked from day one. I've also been to the Royal Shakespeare Company many, many times in Stratford, and I've had the privilege and pleasure to see actors like Kenneth Branagh, Ralph Fiennes, Maggie Smith, Dame Judi Dench to tread those hallowed boards. So this week, I thought as I eased myself back into it, I'd follow up that podcast with a quickie, a wee bit of a deep dive into the absolute greatness of Shakespeare and how he can affect us today in a very contemporary way. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. 3 can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. 2 amazing quotes from Shakespeare. The last one is actually my favorite, of course, and of course there's lots of others from the great bard, arguably the greatest writer in the English language, and arguably the world's greatest ever dramatist. After 5.5 centuries, isn't that amazing? After 5.5 centuries, he actually remains as popular as he ever was. He's constantly studied, he's performed, his plays are reinterpreted throughout the world. But how did Shakespeare become so famous, and how has he remained transcendent above all others? To me and to many, he's the great global icon of Englishness, and probably literature generally in the world today. But how and why? I think partly because he is a great writer, but I don't think that answers all the reasons why. It's too simplistic. I think it's also connected to the spread of Englishness. I think there's an imperial issue there about the way in which he gets taken up in later centuries as this icon of Englishness, just at the time when the British Empire is actually spreading across the globe. And now I think there's a way in which the power of the writing is so transcendent and that he can cross so many different cultures that he is the great global icon that he is today because of that, but not without issues, not without problems, I don't think. Shakespeare is really interesting because he straddles 2 great moments in English history, and I think this is one of the reasons he has such longevity and power. He lives in the period from 1564 to 1616, which crosses the Tudor and the Stuart dynasties. So he's famously living under Queen Elizabeth I, who reigned from 1558 to 1603. But then the second of Shakespeare's career is under a different monarch by the name of James I, who's a Jacobean Stuart ruler from Scotland. So he crosses these two great moments. And what's interesting is that he actually writes very differently across those two periods. And I think that's really important for the way in which we think about the kind of drama that he produces. And don't forget also that he's lived between country and city, and that's also really important too. He's famously born and brought up in Stratford-upon-Avon, where he lives for the first 20 years of his life. But then he appears in London, this great urban conurbation in the late 1580s. Just as commercial theatre is taking off in London, which is a completely new form of entertainment, and Shakespeare is right at the heart of it. At this stage, Shakespeare's working for a company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which is one of these companies that is set up in the 1580s, usually by elitist, aristocratic men who are bankrolling the creation of these companies. There's money to be made. And of course, they're commercial, and they're working in open-air theatres. Shakespeare's company is actually working in playhouses called the Curtain and the Theatre, two amazing theatres that were actually around just before the Globe opens in 1599. And these are big open-air amphitheatres that you can watch plays at during the day, and that actually shapes the kind of plays that you get. So these big, grand history plays, you think of plays like Henry VI, which is one of the first ones that he creates in the early 1590s with the company. And Shakespeare's playing in them as well. And this is one of the interesting things about him. He's not just writing the plays, but he's actually playing in his own works. And I think that gives him a certain angle on the kind of work that gets made. So one of the questions that I had while researching this was, do you think that Shakespeare was considered something special then? In his own lifetime, or was he seen as one of many talented playwrights and poets at the time? And the conclusion was that he was really just seen as one among many. And I think he has a real inferiority complex around a figure who is regarded as much more innovative in his day, and that's Christopher Marlowe. Shakespeare's always trying to play catch up with Marlowe. Known as Kit Marlowe, he famously dies mid-1593, and from then on, Shakespeare is out of his shadow. But he's also working with a bunch of other writers who were seen as equally brilliant at the time, equally talented people, like Thomas Nashe, who I believe collaborates with Shakespeare on a number of his plays. And there was a lot of collaboration during this period. Collaboration would have been the norm, and definitely not the exception. Kit Marlowe, on the other hand, was known for many things. First and foremost, he was a playwright, probably the most famous of all the Elizabethan playwrights, and a great dramatist. But he was also a poet and a translator, and it was rumored that he was a government spy and an atheist. Both very dangerous professions back in those days. But he and Shakespeare most definitely collaborated. Shakespeare is also writing other people's plays, so he's part of a whole very complicated group of writers working in this incredibly new institution. I mean, theatre's not new, but commercial theatre, where you actually put bums on seats for money, is. And that's what Shakespeare is part of. But he's just one of many other writers, many other aspirational lower middle class writers of the time. But, and I think this is interesting, there is chatter about him in the news sheets. Famously, a writer called Green says that Shakespeare's an upstart crow. And this is certainly the way that people are starting to see him. He's a bit of an uppity writer. He's a bit of a show-off. But again, he's still just part of a group of many talented writers who are doing poetry and drama. It's not until later that he's given this exceptional, almost godlike status. But that's definitely not the case during the Elizabethan period. He's definitely a man of the theatre initially, but his reputation is actually established through poetry, because in 1593 he actually publishes a poem called Venus and Adonis, which is a massive hit. It's published and printed, and he gains a certain reputation as being a rather risque, a rather sexy writer, because it's talking about the goddess Venus chasing after a young boy called Adonis. And it is rather sexually sort of risky. It's a bit racy. And people in the street are actually commenting a lot about this poem. And it's interesting because Shakespeare seems to write it because the theatres are closed because of the plague at that point. So it's also a bit of an accident, but it's very serendipitous. And I think Shakespeare regards himself as a poet who's writing drama, as most of his contemporaries did as well, because the notion of a dramatist in the commercial context was still something seen as quite new and also a little bit vulgar. So almost accidentally, his reputation is established as a bit of a sexy poet. And this actually carries on as he writes the Rape of Lucrece, which is another classical epic poem. And he's also writing sonnets throughout this period as well. So still very much a man of the theatre, but certainly almost by happenstance, a man who defines himself, I think, in terms of popular elements as a poet. I then wondered if Shakespeare's fame came about more when the text of his plays became more available in print. And I think what's fascinating is after he dies in 1623, so 7 years after his death, a bunch of his friends from the King's Men, who are the company that he works for with the Royal Seal of Approval to actually use that name, they produced a posthumous collection of, well, not really his complete works, although a lot of his works. And this is called the First Folio. And it's really unusual. In fact, it's highly unusual. Only Ben Jonson's done a similar sort of collected works publication in 1616. And everybody is appalled by this. They think it's absolutely vulgar that dramatists put out their work in print because it's not supposed to be. It's not the done thing. You do it as a poet, but you don't do it as a dramatist. Of course, Shakespeare is never really involved. I mean, obviously, he's dead. But it's interesting that this book, The First Folio, I think it does cement a certain version of his power, his fame, but it's created by the people. They say he's the great virtuoso dramatic poet. Nobody else is as great as him. He stands alone. You know, this is definitely not the reputation that he had during his lifetime. And although some of his texts are actually published and printed in his lifetime, we actually see no evidence that he has any involvement in their publication whatsoever. It's the publishers who publish them. And they say they are by William Shakespeare, but there's no evidence that he's involved in those publications at all. So the print history, I think, is very important for him, but it's very much after he dies. Then the question begs, do you think the publication of his plays lead to other people putting his plays on in other places? And of course, the answer to that is obviously yes, because once you have the printed text, then you have a different kind of dissemination, and the texts do have a different kind of life on the English stage. We see that change. And then even beyond it, because we know now that by the very early 17th century, Shakespeare's plays are being performed in Germany, rather extraordinarily, with some of the commercial companies traveling to mainland Europe, often during periods of political tension or plague if the English playhouses are closed. So if you have the printed book with you, then that certainly helps. So the print is a really important dimension of Shakespeare's power, you know, the power of his texts. I then wondered to what extent was the adulation that Shakespeare received from, other authors or other influentials, in raising his profile as one of the greats, if not the greatest. And I think there's always that sense in which if you're a writer's writer, then you're definitely going to go far. And really, from those rather early, rather snarky comments that we have from Green, saying that he's a bit of an upstart crow, through to people like Jonson. I mean, Ben Jonson actually saw Shakespeare as a great rival, but he actually acknowledged him as an exceptional writer. And of course, then it goes right through the English canon with guys like Milton admiring him in the mid-17th century. And really, that moment when the Romantics pick up Shakespeare, I think that is a crucial shift in his fortunes, where people like Wordsworth and Coleridge, even earlier, Dr. Johnson, writing and editing Shakespeare and saying, this man is extraordinary. there's something completely singular about his ability to write in the English language, which is something completely new. And here's a news article that came out in the late Victorian era that I'll read to you verbatim. And I quote, "Shakespeare is above all writers, at least above all modern writers, the poet of nature, the poet that holds up to his readers a faithful mirror of manners and of life. His characters are not mortified by the customs of particular places unpracticed by the rest of the world, nor by the peculiarities of studies or professions which can operate but upon small numbers, or by the accidents of transient fashions or temporary opinions. They are the genuine progeny of common humanity, such as the world will always supply, and the observation will always find. These persons act and speak by the influence of those general passions and principles by which all minds are agitated, and the whole system of life is continued in motion. In the writings of other poets, a character is too often an individual. In those of Shakespeare, he is commonly a species." Unquote. And I think that changes the whole perception of who Shakespeare is and what he writes. And that was cemented clearly in the Victorian period, when his works are then edited again, and he becomes really just part of the DNA of English, not just drama, but also literature per se. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Orthodomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia, my second home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Orthodomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Orthodomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. There was also a period, the interregnum, where all public stage performances were banned by the Puritan rulers, and I wondered if his popularity had suffered at that point. And the conclusion I came to was that everybody's did, because the texts weren't really available. And if I'm honest, I don't really like the term interregnum because it suggests it's just an unfortunate Republican period, that it's an aberration and that England will soon get back to being a nice royalist country. So I'm not very happy about it, or the idea really that somehow it puts a block on Shakespeare, because really there's generally a way in which the theatre goes into abeyance. But during the Restoration, the plays obviously appear again, and Shakespeare's reputation is cemented again, although he's not the most popular. So Ben Jonson is actually equally as popular. Interestingly, two subsequent playwrights who also work in the King's Men, and Shakespeare, I believe, collaborates with them late in his career, are more popular than Shakespeare. And these two are Beaumont and Fletcher, who were producing these rather sort of precious, tragic, comic plays, but they were actually more popular than Shakespeare during the Restoration period. And I absolutely love this. People then also start rewriting his plays. So you get people like Liam Tay, who doesn't like King Lear, so he changes the ending and he rewrites it, where Lear and Cordelia actually live happily ever after. And the Restoration is an interesting moment where it takes Shakespeare, but also there's all kinds of very strange things with Shakespeare as well. But there's a sense in which his popularity is clearly represented in the fact that people feel that they can do that with his work. I actually thought that it was in the Victorian era that Shakespeare emerged and dominated the stages of London. But the late 18th century is the point where Shakespeare really becomes totally predominant on the London stage. And that's also when you have these great figures, great impresarios like David Garrick taking on his plays. You know, Garrick actually plays all the great roles during his career and says, you know, Shakespeare is all of life itself. And I think this creates this very overblown version of Shakespeare in a way, which also sat alongside the way in which there's been a sort of scholarly investment in his plays. So in 1709, there's a man called Nicholas Rowe who does really one of I'd say the first scholarly edition of his plays. And once you have that, that sits alongside a theatrical tradition of people like Garrick being able to play these plays again and again, the great figures, the great tragic heroes. But then also Garrick, we know, going from playing Lear one night to playing Roe, the other night, with that rather histrionic, melodramatic tradition. That's when you really get the confirmation that Shakespeare is the great English playwright. And everybody else, including Marlowe and Johnson, they all fall away. So even by the early Victorian period, I think that tradition of Shakespeare as the preeminent figure, both in terms of who you read, when you're at home, but also in terms of what you see on stage as well. Those two things have come together absolutely. And from then on, well, I think that's it. He is the great bard. I then started to think about the actors and how important to being a star was an actor's ability to actually do Shakespeare well. And it's from people like Garrick in the later 18th century that I think you actually get the notion of testing your ability as an actor alongside the canon of Shakespeare. So as a younger actor, you play many of the comedic roles. You would play Benedict from Much Ado About Nothing, and then you might move on to playing someone like Henry V. And then I think as you mature and age in your later years, your actual ability is defined, I think, by taking on the great tragic roles: Othello, Macbeth, Hamlet, and ultimately Lear. And that's something that I think from the 18th century is very much established as part of what a great actor does. It's an expectation, if you like. It defines the great Victorian actors. And when you think about it, still today will define someone like Sir Ian McKellen, who is a great fan of the show, I would also like to say. McKellen has actually gone through all those great roles during his career. And quite recently, I think it was last year, he said that he would take on King Lear one last time. And that's really a measure of saying that's the ultimate. That's the summit of what you do as a great classical actor. To take on that repertoire and to succeed is seen as a measure of whether you can actually crack those great roles or not. So then I started to wonder about Shakespeare's reputation and how it spread to other European stages. And Shakespeare's reputation overseas in the start, 100 years or so after his death, is an interesting one. And when it gets into Germany, very early, German people are actually saying that Shakespeare, the language of Shakespeare, actually sounds better in German than in English. And there's a great romantic German tradition which has co-opted Shakespeare, in that way. And I love that. And I think it's very much not about a theatrical tradition. It's about a textual tradition. And at the same time, we have Catherine the Great in Russia. She's actually translating Shakespeare into Russian. The Germans, as I was just saying, certainly become involved in that as well. People like Goethe and Schlegel and Schiller, they are saying, and these are prominent guys, but they're actually coming out and saying that this man is extraordinary. They're saying he is extraordinary because of his representation of the imagination. So the Romantics in Germany, of course, would say that because that's what they're trying to do. So they see this abundant, imaginative capacity in Shakespeare's work, as of course do the English Romantics. And I think it's really only in the 19th and 20th century that theatrical tradition more internationally takes on Shakespeare. I mean, the French have always been a little bit reluctant because they don't really like, I suppose, the lack of classical unity perhaps in Shakespeare's works. And I also think there's probably been national rivalries at play there as well. So they're not big fans of Shakespeare. But then certainly I think from the 20th century, the way in which the imperial power of Shakespeare has gone round the globe, meant in a sense, it's how you would actually measure your national theatre, by your ability to actually work with Shakespeare. And I think that that's certainly the case now more than ever. And then Shakespeare works in different ways. So it can be used around national struggles, for instance. And there's prime examples of this in Brazil, for example, where Portuguese translations of a play like Macbeth were actually used to mediate political tensions in terms of what happened in Brazil, over the last couple of decades, in both, I think, in both terms of imperial struggles and certainly in internal national struggles between the right and the left. And if you think I'm wrong on that, please watch Macbeth, watch the play, and compare it to what has taken place in Brazil, over the last 30 or 40 years. And Shakespeare, I think, is a really good vehicle internationally, globally, for different cultures to do just that. To say, we measure our ability to have a debate around political discourse by how we can use Shakespeare and how we can use Shakespeare to do that. And I think that's absolutely wild. And then you also can probably avoid forms of censorship as well when you think about it, because when it does get too hot, you can just say, it's just an old play by an old English playwright. So Shakespeare's extraordinary ability to cross so many different areas is extraordinary. And he himself, I think, in his own moment, of course, working in a very political, volatile era, could suggest that he was engaging with politics. And at another point, he could simply say, it's only a play. It's only entertainment. And again, it's one of the great things about Shakespeare's work, that it cuts both ways. You can actually have it both ways as you like it, as he himself would have said. So then I wondered how important had been the adoption of Shakespeare's characters into art. Thinking of the pre-Raphaelite painters, for example, depicting Beatrice and Benedict, or in the 20th century in film. And those stories, of course, have spread even further. And the conclusion that I came to was, I think they are now part of common culture, aren't they? Well, I think they are. I mean, if you think about a phrase like to be or not to be, you think of a figure like Hamlet. Most school children around the globe have some access to that story. Think about Romeo and Juliet similarly. And what's interesting about Shakespeare, because many of his stories weren't original, he's actually taking them from the common people, because he's a great Renaissance man in that period. Imitation of classical sources was actually seen as a very good thing and not a bad thing. And of course, today we call it plagiarism, but they didn't have plagiarism back in those days. And that Shakespeare is borrowing all of his stories from the common people, I think is rather special. But what I think is absolutely fascinating is that he's very shrewdly taking those great iconic stories, Romeo and Juliet, which is the great love story, Hamlet, which is the great family tragedy. In a way, it's also one of the really great political tragedies. The world was a smaller place back then, and I think it's interesting in many ways that the world today hasn't changed, not in Shakespeare's arena in any course. It's the iconicity of those stories, I think, which is now suffused in common culture in a way which is sometimes good and sometimes bad. But the whole debate, say around his representation of women, and you might want to question something like that now. But if you look at someone like, look at Gertrude in Hamlet, not necessarily regarded as a very positive figure in contemporary culture. But what's great about it is that you can actually have a debate. You can always use Shakespeare to have a debate almost about anything that's going on within your common culture. And I love that. You can somehow access that. You can access Shakespeare to have hopefully what you might call a dialogic conversation that's not one that's going to get nasty, because that's not the nature of theatre. Theatre is about an exchange of different ideas, of competing, often conflicting ideas. And that's why I think you can still turn to Shakespeare in that way. Often trying to understand and putting it into contemporary culture, because you can at least have a debate. And that's really important. That's why Shakespeare, I think, is still relevant to us today, and why he's so important. Everyone, thank you for listening in. Again, my apologies about the tardiness in kind of getting these to you in a timely manner. I am going to rectify that this week by getting a few out to you, and then I'll keep it going towards Christmas. I mean, Christmas, can you believe it? We're heading into that part of the year. So thank you again for listening in, guys. It's greatly appreciated, and I'll look forward to chatting to you soon. Bye for now.